Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable at the end of April. Don't know about you, but I can't believe we're there already. Great to have so many people in the room with us today for our first kind of co-sponsored session with Alertacall. So to those who don't know, Alertacall are sponsoring the 2024 sessions this year. I'm delighted to have them with us. A bit more on those very shortly. But also this is our first kind of co-sponsored session. And to those who don't know, I've worked with James on a few projects on and off for the last couple of years. So it's great to be working with him today. And he's kindly brought and introduced me to Neil Butters, who's going to be talking from Procurement for Housing as well today. Today's session, as you'll have seen, is all about procurement. It's looking at innovation. And the idea today is that we're going to be looking at just how much new technology and innovation there is available for social housing providers to enhance and accelerate their business practices. But so often it's actually more about building great quality homes, looking after its tenants when we're looking at the sector more broadly, that we don't necessarily look at those innovation skills when we're looking at recruitment. So as I say, I've been working in recruitment for 11 years. My recruitment business is what keeps this going. I set up on my own just over 3 years ago. But when we're looking at innovation, we're thinking about what we can learn. We're looking about what new procedures and procurement ideas we can trial. But are these are the kind of procurement processes that we actually go through to secure these new practices, are they fit for purpose? And so we've got James with us today, like I say, from Alertacall, who spent years, if you haven't heard James's story, it's amazing, but I'm sure he'll share some of it today, helping housing providers navigate the complexities of those of that innovative practice and of procurement in general, something I can absolutely testify to from a recruitment side. But we've also got Neil Butters from Procurement for Housing. So he's worked with hundreds of housing providers, helping them on lots and lots of different matters, loads to share with you today. But a lot of that, again, is around that innovative practice. So I'm going to pass across to James first, who's going to hopefully talk to us about figuring out what you need and why that's so important in the first place. And then there's the bit where you go and buy it. So James, I'll pass over to you for your introductions.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm James Batchelor. I'm the founder of an organisation called Alertacall. And why am I here talking with any authority whatsoever today on procurement? Well, it's, I guess, because I've spent 20 or so years on the other side of the table trying to bring our innovations to housing providers. And it's been really, really interesting to figure out what hurdles we need to go through, but more often actually what the housing provider needs to go through to adopt innovations like ours and those from the thousands of other companies out there that have got cool stuff. Just by way of background to our innovations and what we started selling into the social housing sector, don't worry, I'm only going to keep this dead brief. And just to give you an idea of what an innovation might look like, well, look at Alertacall. We provide people with digital touchscreens that can go into their homes to help with two-way tenant engagement. They're mainly for older people. We innovated this idea of an OK each day button to check that tenants are safe and protect undiscovered deaths. And we also do stuff as well around warden call systems and doing all that differently in a different way, you know, challenging the idea that it should just be some beige box on the wall. But kind of getting those kind of things adopted in social housing, and like I say, there's hundreds of other innovations that you could make use of, has been really difficult. And I think that's because, and Matt alluded to it earlier, traditionally housing providers haven't kind of back in the day gone out of their way to hire people who know about innovation and buying innovation and what are the perils and pitfalls of that and what you need to look out for. But I do think that's changing. And I think there are probably two reasons why housing providers need to become really good at kind of discovering and buying innovation. And the first one is there might be a really neat, cool solution to a problem that you already know you have. And by going out and talking to innovative companies and innovators specifically, you might find a solution. But also there's another dimension to it, which is by actively going out and talking to innovators, you might actually come across problems that you didn't know you had. because innovators are out there trying to fix a whole plethora of challenges for the sector. And by connecting yourself to more of them, you might actually be exposed to stuff you didn't know. So they're two good reasons. So I guess when we're talking about innovation, it's probably worth trying to figure out what do we really mean by it. But it's probably really quite straightforward. It's just something quite new or different in some way to what you're used to and that you might not have used before. Something that might have even been around for a little while and being used by other organizations might feel like an innovation to you. And like I say, what could it encompass? It could encompass tenant engagement technologies like our touchscreen, IoT devices and sensors, things like this. These are environmental sensors that go into people's homes. Obviously, there's been lots of discussion about that over the past 12, 18 months across the entire sector. Maybe it's apps, for self-service or chatbots or AIs that could help you streamline processes like arrears and rent collection. But I guess one of the really big tells that something is innovative is that there's not that many people supplying it by its very, very definition. So if you've got dozens and dozens and dozens of people supplying something, it has probably moved beyond the threshold of being an innovation.
And yet we have that other issue, don't we, where you go to something like the housing conference or any of that, and there are hundreds of suppliers providing everything.
Yeah.
And so and there's some stuff coming through in the chat already, which I'll come into, but that blend between trying to find something truly innovative that isn't, I know it comes through recommendations and things along those lines, but how do you, when you've worked with housing providers, how are you kind of not just standing out yourselves, but more how are housing providers engaging with yourself as a service to check that you are truly what you say you are?
Oh, that's a complex question. Yeah, so it's where how do housing providers figure out that you are what you really say you are? So that's a really good question, actually, and I might cover that in a minute in some detail. But here's the thing: most of the things that you're presented with as innovation will be being used by somebody else in the sector already. It's very unusual. It can be very exciting or scary depending on the culture of your organization. It's very unusual to be using something absolutely at the bleeding edge. So even when you go to those conferences and those exhibitions and you see something cool and new that you think could help you and you think, wow.
About 12:15.
No, yeah, sorry, there you are, Tony. I've just muted you there. Back to you, James.
Sorry.
No problem, Tony, at all. Normally, if you go to those vendors, you'll find that there's somebody else already using that stuff. And actually, this is an interesting point because the sector is kind of mithered when it comes to buying innovation by selecting, identifying, testing innovation, so to determine whether it's fit for purpose. And then even when you've done all that, there are real complexities around the actual procurement of it as well. How do you actually go about buying it in a way that your procurement team will consider compliant? And so actually when a housing provider is looking at new cool stuff, it's actually got two very separate sets of issues to deal with. How do we evaluate the innovation and how do we go about actually buying it in a way that the procurement team will allow? So actually, leading on from your point, Matt, I think one of the first things that people might make a mistake with when they're looking at innovation is that they try and move it into a formal market process too quickly. If you're out there trying to fix a business problem and you've identified this idea that there might be some technology or some gadget or widget or innovation to help, then you really owe it to yourself to spend as much time as possible speaking to those innovators and speaking to those suppliers and learning about that space before you get anywhere near a procurement exercise. And remember, at that point, it isn't procurement, it's discovery and learning and education. I guess one of the things that we see is people trying to push into a formalized procurement process before they actually know what it is they're buying themselves. And that rarely goes well. It rarely goes well. You'll see tenders appear that are very difficult for the innovative suppliers to pitch in for, and they'll often kind of break or fail at the end because the customer didn't know what they were asking for. So I think anybody that's involved in buying cool new stuff and innovation needs to allow themselves more time to do their own market research and educate themselves. And if there's pushback from procurement teams about that, right, just kind of politely, if you can, remind them that you're not yet in a procurement exercise yet, you're just in discovery. Now you can do kind of pre-market engagement and invite suppliers in, but I think what I'm really suggesting is that should be as informal and as educational as possible for as long as possible before you hit the go button on buying something. Here's the other thing. I mean, you mentioned how do you go about qualifying whether an innovation supplier does what it says on the tin. So the sector is kind of obsessed with pilots, really, right? Wanting to pilot things for short periods. Or we'll buy 10 of these widgets, or get 50 of our customers using this thing. And I have two comments about pilots, and this is over 20 years of working with housing providers on pilots. That one, if you're going to do a pilot, make sure it's big enough that the info you're getting off the back of it is actually relevant. But more importantly, you should never get into a pilot unless you know what you're going to do after the pilot. So there should be key success criteria. So if you're going to go into a pilot with a supplier for anything, you're not research institutes. You're actually there piloting this stuff to try and get some business benefit. So if the pilot is a success based upon metrics that you've identified at the start of it, you should know what you're doing next, which is a rollout or something like that. And honestly, the sector wastes so much time doing pilots on things that are not going to go anywhere because it wasn't kind of signed off in advance that it would go somewhere. And sometimes, dare say, doing pilots that are unnecessary anyway, because quite often you can find other housing providers that have adopted stuff that are very, very similar to you, and you can go and learn from them. Why do we always have to kind of waste time trialing something for 6 months or 12 months when we know actually there are other places, we can go and get the thumbs up or otherwise about whether it worked or not.
I would just add to that as well. Don't use a pilot or don't trial something that you know is probably going to fail just to prove it fails. And I don't know if you've seen this, James. Like, I've had it a number of times where someone's like, right, Matt, well, we need a temp for Monday. And if you get us in the temp for Monday, we know you're good. I'm like, that isn't proving whether I can do my job. That's just if I know somebody who's available. Those are two different things. And it's understanding that setting up to fail bit. But I think when you come to procurement, and the chat is raising lots and lots of points, we've got a huge piece which I'm going to come back to later around data and who's holding data and where that sits and everything else. But Chantel's just said there that procurement teams need to research innovations before putting together tenders and reconsider standard procurement hurdles within the tender documents, which are often a barrier to innovative SME. But Neil's countered that, well, isn't there a difference between finding innovation against using it? And just before we brought Neil in, I just wanted your thoughts on that, James.
I think it's right. I mean, I think there's two things going on there, and I think it's one of those things where both points of view are absolutely right. Right, I think so. What Chantel is saying is right, that we're often invited into formal procurement processes that are actually written in such a way that it's impossible to even educate. So here's the thing, right? If you think you know what you're buying, right, and you think you know what you want, and you go into a formalized procurement process and you set that all out in a specification, then you're preventing the vendors from talking about all the extra stuff that they could deliver or a different way of fixing your problem. So I think tenders need to be much, much more outcome based. What is the outcome that you're trying to achieve, not what is the gear that you're trying to buy. So, I mean, a tender coming out and saying, a piece of procurement coming out and saying, these are the problems we're trying to fix. Please come to us with your solutions. That is pro-innovation, because at that point you'll be exposed to a wide range of different methodologies for fixing a problem. But as for trying it out, I agree with that. I mean, it's legit to want to try something out, but I revert back to my point before. If you're going to try it out, do it properly and know where you're going with it. You know, or go and ask somebody else's input on what their experiences were. I think you know, we see a lot of failed pilots across the sector. I mean, fortunately for us, we don't really now go into any pilots where we're not absolutely certain the housing provider kind of knows what its outcomes are, because we want to go into a pilot knowing we can deliver on the outcomes that we talk about. But it is a challenge, and it's a mess. It can be a mess, you know, to overcome some of these things.
So much of that comes down to the initial framework that gets put together, as you've mentioned. So much of it gets put down to the you know, like I said, really knowing what you're after. And Neil, I mean, I potentially a good time to bring you in here, which is obviously your side with procurement for housing. So talk a little bit about, I guess, your role, frameworks in general, but your experience of housing providers trying to procure innovation, but through the framework